It started on an ordinary Saturday morning in my San Francisco home when my sister dropped her kids off without warning. I was just finishing up some code reviews for Monday, wrapped in my favorite Stanford hoodie, and enjoying my coffee when the doorbell rang. The sound felt jarring in my usually quiet weekend routine. Opening the door, I was stunned to see my nephews, Jacob, 10, and Nathan, 7, standing there in their school uniforms, clutching overnight bags. An Uber was pulling away from my driveway. My heart sank as I noticed holes in Nathan's socks and how Jacob's uniform blazer seemed at least one size too small. Aunt Lily? Jacob's voice trembled slightly. Mom said we're staying with you while she goes on vacation for 8 weeks. I hadn't spoken to my sister Emma since our family's July 4th barbecue, where she'd made nasty comments about my weight despite me being a regular at my local cycling studio. The Silicon Valley nerd look isn't working for you, she'd sneered while I was getting seconds of potato salad. My nephews were good, quiet kids, clearly confused and uncomfortable on my doorstep. I ushered them inside, my mind racing. As a senior software engineer at one of Silicon Valley's top tech companies, I was used to solving complex problems, but this was outside my usual debugging territory. I immediately started calling Emma while the boys settled nervously on my living room couch. She ignored my first 10 calls, which wasn't surprising. Emma had always been like this, erratic, self-centered, treating everyone around her like NPCs in her personal game. When she finally picked up, I got straight to the point. Emma, I'm calling CPS if you don't come get your kids right now. I was already Googling the number for Child Protective Services on my second monitor. That's when her voice dropped into something I'd never heard before. Low, menacing, almost unrecognizable. Go ahead, little sister. I'll just call your precious tech company and tell them you're not taking your bipolar medication. How long do you think you'll keep that fancy engineering job once Azure hears about your mental breakdown? The threat hit me like a system crash. Sudden, devastating, and potentially catastrophic. My career in tech was everything I'd built to escape my family's toxic orbit. I'd worked my way up from a scholarship at Stanford to my current position, and the thought of losing it all to Emma's lies made my hands shake as I disconnected the call. At home, day one, I stared at my phone, my mind racing to debug this human problem like I would a complex algorithm. But family issues weren't as straightforward as code. There was no simple if-else statement to resolve this situation. Not only was I unable to watch her kids, but I had a crucial trip planned in a month to visit my boyfriend Eric in Australia. We'd met through an online gaming community, and this would be my first time meeting his family in person. The trip represented everything I'd worked for, the freedom to live life on my own terms, away from my family's chaos. I reluctantly called my mother Diana, though I should have known better. She'd always sided with Emma, treating my academic and career achievements like they were bugs rather than features. They're old enough to take an Uber to your house alone anyway. My mother dismissed my concerns. Emma has done so much for you, Lily. You need to be there for her just this once. That made me lose it. My debugging patience snapped. Tell me one single time Emma has improved my life in any way. I found myself shouting into my phone, my voice echoing in my home office. Both of you have treated me like I'm some deprecated code that should have been removed from the family repository years ago. I demanded she come over, thinking that worst case, I could leave Diana at my house to watch the boys while I flew to Australia. I had little hope that Emma would abandon her vacation to come back for her kids. My sister had always been quick to push her responsibilities onto others, like trying to merge bad code without testing. When Diana finally arrived at my place, she looked at me with the same contempt she'd shown throughout my childhood, as if my existence was a persistent bug in her perfect family system. We sat in my living room, surrounded by my carefully curated tech books and gaming memorabilia, while she lectured me about family obligations. I ignored my mother's attempt to guilt-trip me and demanded to know exactly what kind of vacation was so important that Emma would abandon her kids with someone who essentially had her blocked on all social media. Something about this didn't pass the basic unit tests of logic. That's when my mother's face changed, her mask slipping like a failed authentication attempt. Emma isn't just going on vacation, she finally admitted. She's being flown out by her sugar daddy. I actually laughed out loud. It sounded like the kind of bad joke you'd find in Legacy Code comments. But Diana's face remained deadly serious, and the reality of the situation hit me like a fatal exception error. Confrontation. My emotions crashed like an overloaded server as I processed this information. "You're actually okay with this?" I demanded, my voice rising with each word. "Your golden child is abandoning her kids to fly off with a sugar daddy instead of getting a real job like I did. I spent years studying computer science, building my career, while she was doing what exactly?" Diana's response was pure venom, the same toxicity I'd grown up with. "It doesn't matter how many fancy degrees you have, or how big your Silicon Valley paycheck is," she spat. "You'll always be the ugly duckling, Lily. Born ugly, die ugly." The words hit me like a distributed denial of service attack, overwhelming my emotional firewalls. I had to physically restrain myself from grabbing her designer blazer and throwing her out. When I screamed at her to get out of my house, she refused to move, as stubborn as a frozen system. When I tried to guide her toward the door, she suddenly shoved me with surprising force. I stumbled backward into my coffee table, knocking over a handmade ceramic vase, a gift Eric had brought from a small Australian artist during his last visit. The vase shattered into pieces on my hardwood floor, much like my composure. Looking at the broken vase, something in me broke too. Years of suppressed error messages finally surfaced. I started screaming and crying, telling her to get out before I called the police. I felt terrible knowing my nephews could hear everything from the guest room, but my system was in complete meltdown. After I finally managed to force Diana out, Jacob and Nathan peeked out from the guest room. Their wide, nervous eyes reminded me of myself at their age, constantly monitoring the environment for potential threats, like a hypervigilant security scanner. "Is everything okay, Aunt Lily?" Jacob asked softly. His gentle concern made my heart ache more than any code deployment gone wrong. Even though I barely knew them, these were just kids caught in their mother's chaotic runtime environment. I ordered DoorDash for all of us and let them play my gaming console until they fell asleep in the living room. It was the least I could do to create some sense of stability in their clearly unstable lives. Phone call with Emma. When I finally got through to Emma again, the conversation went exactly as badly as a failed production deployment. Her voice had that same sinister quality, like a corrupted audio file. "Listen carefully, Little Miss Silicon Valley," she hissed through the phone. "It's simple. Either you watch my kids, or I destroy your precious career. I know you're nothing without that fancy tech job." Her words pierced through my defenses like a zero-day exploit. She was right. While I had my degree and an impressive GitHub portfolio, my identity was deeply intertwined with my career success. I'd spent years building my reputation in the tech industry, and the thought of losing it reduced me to tears. "Why do you hate me so much?" I choked out. "And how could you abandon your kids for a sugar daddy?" Her laugh was cold and distorted. "Oh, please. I'm the type of woman who can make millions from a sugar daddy in 2 months. That's something you'll never understand, stuck behind your computer screen all day." Each word felt like malicious code attacking my self-worth. We went back and forth until she hung up with a final threat about contacting my employer. I sat in my home office, surrounded by my dual monitors and mechanical keyboard, feeling completely powerless despite all my technical expertise. Later that evening, the boys were downstairs watching Netflix on my gaming setup, so I retreated to my bedroom to call Eric. I hadn't had a chance to talk to him since this chaos began, and as soon as I heard his Australian accent, I broke down completely. "They just showed up in an Uber, Eric," I sobbed, explaining everything. "Emma's threatening to destroy my career. My mom's still treating me like a failed program, and I don't know what to do." Despite being on the other side of the world, Eric's support felt like a secure connection in a world of dropped packets. He listened carefully, then spoke with the methodical clarity I'd first admired in our gaming sessions. "Your sister's committing multiple crimes here, love," he pointed out. "Abandoning her kids, blackmail. You need to document everything. Record her threats about the false medical accusations. Think of it like logging system errors. Gathered the evidence." Eric knew my history with Emma and Diana, and he was right about Emma being unhinged. The fact that she'd resort to career blackmail wasn't just a bug in her personality. It was a feature. Evening with the nephews. Despite feeling emotionally overwhelmed, I knew I needed to make my nephews feel safe. I'd experienced firsthand what it felt like to be an unwanted child, and I refused to perpetuate that cycle. Heading downstairs, I found them tentatively exploring my gaming setup. Their faces lit up when I offered to play some multiplayer games. "You know how to play FPS games, Aunt Lily?" Jacob asked incredulously. "I'm actually pretty good," I smiled, settling into my gaming chair. "Want to see?" For the next few hours, our laughter filled my usually quiet house. The boys were genuinely shocked when I kept getting victory after victory, and their giggles were better than any successful code deployment I'd ever had. During our pizza break, we had a contest to see who could eat the most pepperoni slices. As I watched them laugh and play, I realized I genuinely loved these kids. Unlike Emma, they were sweet, polite, and considerate, always saying please and thank you, cleaning up after themselves without being asked. The next day, as I spent more time with them, I started noticing concerning details. Jacob's school uniform was worn thin at the elbows, and Nathan's socks all had holes. Going through the clothes Emma had packed, everything was either too small or badly worn. "Hey guys," I said, closing my laptop for the day. "Want to go shopping?" The trip to the mall revealed more about their life with Emma than any status report could have. They were almost afraid to ask for anything, acting like each store was read only, not meant for them to touch. Can we really go in there?" Nathan asked hesitantly, pointing at a gaming store, his eyes wide behind his glasses. My heart broke. As someone who remembered being the kid who couldn't have things, I couldn't help but want to give them everything. "Of course we can. And you can pick out whatever you want." By the end of our shopping spree, they had new clothes that actually fit, fresh school supplies, and yes, their own Nintendo Switches. When I handed them the gaming consoles, both boys burst into tears, hugging me tightly. On the drive home, I noticed Jacob wiping his eyes again. "What's wrong, buddy? Why are you being so nice to us?" he asked, his voice small. "Why do we deserve it?" I had to pull over, my own vision blurring. "Because you're my boys too," I managed to say. "And you deserve to be happy just because you exist." That's enough. This only made him cry harder. "I'm angry at Mom," he confessed, "for keeping us away from you." The truth comes out. As we got closer, the boys slowly opened up about their life with Emma. Like debugging a complex system, each revelation exposed more critical errors in their home environment. Their stories of neglect and emotional manipulation made my stomach turn. It was all too familiar. Recording the evidence. That evening, after cooking dinner and getting the boys settled with their new switches, I retreated to my office to implement Eric's plan. I called Emma again, this time with my recording software running. The same setup I used for documenting technical meetings. I kept my voice steady, channeling the same calm I used during system outages. As predicted, Emma took the bait immediately when I mentioned CPS. "Go ahead and try," she snarled, her voice distorting through the phone. "Nobody will believe a mentally unstable freak like you. I don't care if you're actually taking medication or not. Who do you think they'll believe? The concerned sister or the crazy programmer?" She sounded unhinged, repeating phrases like a stuck loop. "You don't deserve anything in this life. You don't deserve anything." It was like listening to corrupted audio, making me wonder if she was under the influence of something. The next morning, as soon as the CPS office opened, I made the call. My hands were steady as I explained everything: the abandonment, the coercion, the threats. The recording worked like a perfect proof of concept, demonstrating Emma's manipulation clearly. The CPS agent listened to the recording and responded with unexpected efficiency. "This is clear evidence of parental neglect and criminal coercion," she stated. "We're opening an investigation immediately." After hanging up, I sat at my desk, trembling like I'd just pushed a major update to production. I spent the rest of the day with my nephews, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy while my report propagated through the system. Diana's reaction. The next day, my phone lit up with Diana's name. Like a critical error notification I knew I shouldn't ignore. In my emotionally vulnerable state, I answered. "How dare you call CPS?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "After everything your sister." I cut her off mid-process. "Emma will finally face consequences for her actions," I declared. The line went dead immediately. Diana had force quit the conversation. My hands were shaking after the call. Making the CPS report had been nerve-wracking enough, but telling Diana felt like deliberately introducing a virus into the family system. I knew she would immediately alert Emma, putting her 2 steps ahead of me. It was the same pattern that had run since our childhood. The next day at work. Walking into our open plan office the next morning, my receptionist's message hit me like a critical system alert. "Your supervisor scheduled an urgent meeting before lunch." I'd been expecting this. Emma's revenge query was executing right on schedule. The meeting room felt like a pressure chamber, with my 2 supervisors and an unknown executive I'd never met before, all watching me like I was suspicious code flagged by the security scanner. "We've received some concerning information from a trusted family source," my supervisor began carefully. "There are allegations about unmanaged mental health issues." They proceeded to describe elaborate stories about supposed psychotic episodes, clearly fabricated by Emma. But like any good engineer, I'd come prepared with extensive documentation. I pulled out my briefcase and distributed copies of letters from my doctor, therapist, and psychiatrist, along with 5 years of prescription records showing consistent medication management. My documentation was as thorough as any technical specification. "I want to be transparent," I explained professionally. "These claims are demonstrably false, as evidenced by the medical documentation before you. They're coming from a family member who's currently under investigation by CPS for child abandonment." The meeting aftermath. My supervisors reviewed the documentation with the same attention they'd give a critical code review. Their suspicion visibly dissolved as they saw the multiple medical verifications and consistent records. "We appreciate your thoroughness in addressing this," my supervisor finally said, actually looking embarrassed. "And while we had to investigate, I want to mention that your team's latest project deployment was flawless. The client specifically praised your leadership." I left the meeting feeling like I'd just successfully defended against a major security breach. The validation from my supervisor was an unexpected bonus, a small win in the midst of chaos. Confronting Emma. I called Emma as soon as I got to my car. unable to contain my satisfaction at her failed attack. "Your little plan just crashed and burned," I told her, my voice steady. "The meeting lasted 15 minutes because your accusations sounded as unstable as you are. My medical documentation trumped your lies." "You're lying." Emma's voice crackled with rage. "They must have fired you." I actually laughed. "You failed at this just like you failed at everything else in your life. The only skill you have at almost 40 is lying and failing. Even your own children are disappointed in you." Emma exploded into a stream of profanity, calling me every curse word in her limited vocabulary. "You've betrayed me," she screamed. "I'm getting on the first plane back, and you'll regret everything you've done." I was still smiling when I hung up, but by the time I got home to my nephews, who were in much better spirits since their arrival, reality set in like a system crash. This situation was far from resolved. Emma was returning from overseas, probably with revenge on her mind. The thought sent a chill through me. My sister had nothing left to lose, and she'd always been unstable. For the first time, I feared for my physical safety. Then I thought about my nephews. My heart ached at the idea of them leaving. I'd gotten so close to them, and the thought of watching them return to Emma's custody was unbearable. That night, I checked on them while they slept. Nathan was clutching his new plush Pokémon, and Jacob had fallen asleep reading a coding book I'd given him. Standing in the hallway after closing their door, I cried quietly. These innocent boys deserved so much better than the broken system they'd been born into. The invasion, the next day, started with violence. At 8 a.m., the sound of aggressive pounding on my front door jolted me awake. It wasn't the usual delivery or neighbor. Opening the door, I froze at the sight before me. Emma stood there, but she wasn't alone. Beside her was a mountain of a man, easily 6'5" and 300 pounds, with hands the size of dinner plates. Behind them, Diana lurked like a background process you can't quite kill. Before I could even open my mouth to demand they leave my property, the giant man placed his hand on my shoulder and shoved me down with crushing force. They invaded my home while I lay crumpled on my floor, pain radiating through my shoulder. I started screaming at Emma, demanding to know who this stranger was, but he appeared to only speak Russian. The situation felt surreal, like a nightmare someone else had coded into my reality. My nephews emerged from the guest room, rubbing sleep from their eyes. I tried to position myself between them and the intruders, but Emma barked something in Russian to the man. The next moments were pure chaos. Both boys started pleading to stay with me as the stranger moved toward them. When I attempted to pull Jacob away from him, the man grabbed my head and slammed it into the wall. Through the explosion of stars in my vision, I watched helplessly as he carried my nephews out. Diana followed them, crying but doing nothing to help. The same passive observer she'd always been to abuse. Before leaving, Emma walked over to where I sat holding my throbbing head. Looking up at her, I saw pure hatred in her eyes before she spat directly in my face. They all piled into a black Suburban I'd never seen before, taking my nephews without their shoes, their new clothes, their switches, without even breakfast. My boys were gone, and I collapsed into the worst anxiety attack of my life. Taking action. When I could finally think straight, I knew I had to act fast. I called the police, discovering they were already aware of the CPS investigation. My voice shook, but I forced myself to focus, drawing on the same attention to detail I used in my engineering work. I provided everything: the Russian man's description, the full license plate number of the Suburban, thank God for my trained engineer's eye for detail, and descriptions of everyone's clothing. I also noted Emma's erratic behavior. Her eyes had been wild, her movements jerky. Having seen enough substance abuse in college, I strongly suspected she was high on stimulants. The waiting. After giving the police every fragment of information I could remember, I sat in my silent house, unable to function. Like a system stuck in an infinite loop, I couldn't sleep, eat, or focus. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my nephews' terrified faces. My mind kept running different scenarios, like debugging multiple test cases. I thought about Emma's vacation. Had she really been with a sugar daddy? Or was there something darker involving this Russian man? How long had she been mixed up with him? Then I found myself imagining a different future, one where it was just me and my nephews. I had the space in my home, a good school district, and now space in my heart too. In a custody hearing, I'd be the stable option, a senior software engineer with a spotless record versus an unemployed mother with criminal charges and drug issues. The breakthrough. Hours later, my phone finally rang. The same officer from earlier. "We found them," he said, his voice grim. We had 3 patrol cars respond since we knew about the earlier violence. Even with guns drawn, the Russian man had attacked the officers. He'd punched 2 cops and given a female officer a black eye before they managed to subdue him. Emma had also fought back, attacking the officer, trying to handcuff her. I tried to picture it. My sister and her giant Russian friend physically battling police on a highway shoulder. It felt like watching a system completely crash and burn. Then came the strangest part. Emma wanted to use her one phone call on me. "She's demanding bail money," the officer explained. I actually laughed. "Let her rot," I said. "I'm not taking her call." The officer chuckled understandingly before hanging up. But despite Emma finally facing consequences, my nephews were now in CPS custody. I wasn't allowed to speak with them, despite my pleas about being their only stable family member. My Australia trip was just a week away, and canceling would mean losing thousands in bookings, and more importantly, potentially damaging my relationship with Eric's family before it even began. I'd pictured marrying him someday, and the last thing I wanted was to start off by disrespecting his parents. The escape to Australia. The week before my flight was a blur of tears and frustration. Every conversation with Eric became about my anxiety over the situation. Despite his constant support and understanding, I was angry at Emma for poisoning even this part of my life. "Your sister made her choice to visit a sugar daddy," Eric would say during our video calls. "Don't let her ruin our future too." At the airport bar, 2 cocktails in, I found myself looking at photos from the mall trip with my nephews. The silly photo booth pictures we'd taken together made me cry all over again. I promised myself it would be the last time I'd cry until I returned to America. I had a life too, and I couldn't let Emma corrupt every part of it. In Australia, the moment I saw Eric at the Sydney airport, months of tension began to melt away. He ran to me and swept me up princess style, making my heart explode with happiness. After everything I'd been through, being in his arms felt like coming home to a perfectly functioning system. Meeting his family exceeded all my expectations. His parents were active, fun-loving people who took me hiking to their favorite spots. One day, Eric led me on a private hike to his secret waterfall. We spent hours swimming and laughing together, sharing kisses in the crystal clear water. It was one of the most romantic days of my life. The trip had gone perfectly, despite my earlier anxieties. But of course, when I returned home, the nightmare with Emma resumed like a malicious program waiting to execute. Back to reality. A few days after landing, I went to the local police station to formally press charges against both Emma and Diana for breaking and entering. The man had physically assaulted me in my own home while they watched. I wasn't letting that slide. While there, I learned the CPS investigation was still ongoing. It was frustrating. If they just talked to my nephews, they'd understand what they'd been through. Emma had been arrested with a man who attacked multiple police officers. How was that not enough proof she was an unfit parent? The legal battle begins. Every morning, I'd wake up to see Nathan's stuffed Pokemon on my bedside table. I'd been sleeping with it since Emma had dragged them away. Some mornings, just seeing it made me want to cry. They hadn't even been allowed to take their belongings. My youngest nephew probably missed his plush friend terribly. After weeks of calling CPS daily and demanding updates, they finally reached a decision. They were officially removing both boys from Emma's custody and putting them in protective care. When I first heard this, I was frustrated. How is this any different from their current situation? But then the CPS agent explained that this meant Emma would have to go to court if she ever wanted custody back. More importantly, other relatives could now petition for custody. Before the agent finished his sentence, I knew what I had to do. The courtroom. The case against Emma for breaking and entering began before the custody hearings. The first time I saw her in court was surreal. Our last interaction had been her spitting in my face. She looked terrible, the effects of whatever substances she'd been using clearly visible. When the judge mentioned my separate custody petition, Emma's public defender apparently hadn't warned her. The news of my fighting for custody of her children made her snap completely. Like a program going into catastrophic failure, Emma suddenly lunged at me in the middle of the courtroom, screaming my name. She clawed at my face and tried to rip out chunks of my hair, acting like a feral animal. The bailiff rushed to pull her off, but before he could, she managed to bite my forearm hard enough to draw blood. The bite later got infected, requiring serious antibiotics. All this happened right in front of the judge. As I sat there nursing my wounded arm, I knew Emma had just sealed her fate. Her violent outburst in court was like watching someone deliberately corrupt their own system beyond repair. The long legal process. The legal battles dragged on for nearly 2 years. Thanks to her accumulated crimes, Emma eventually received a substantial sentence. Her chances of appeal were as broken as her moral compass. I never dropped the charges against Diana either. The only way she avoided prison was by turning against Emma in court, throwing her golden child under the bus while crying her usual theatrical tears. Watching my mother finally betray her perfect firstborn was a strange kind of satisfaction. Sitting in that courtroom, watching Diana sob on the witness stand, I realized this would be the last time I'd ever see her. Like deprecated code, she and Emma had no place in my future system architecture. They'd turned my life into an endless legal battle, and I was ready for it to end. The custody battle. The fight for my nephews became more complicated when their birth father and his family joined the legal fray. But I was as persistent in this as I was in debugging critical production issues. I wouldn't give up. After almost 2 years of legal battles, I finally won full custody. Coming home. The day I brought my boys home, their faces lit up when they saw their rooms. I'd spent weeks perfecting them, like optimizing code for the most efficient performance. Nathan ran into his room first, letting out a delighted squeal when he found his Nintendo Switch exactly where he'd left it 2 years ago. When I pulled out his old stuffed Pokemon, he fell into my arms crying. Jacob joined our group hug, both boys crying into my hair, repeatedly telling me how much they'd missed me. "I knew it, Auntie Lily," Jacob said through his tears, looking up at me with those big eyes. "I knew you'd come back for us one day." Standing there, holding my boys, I finally felt like my family system was running exactly as it should be.